Have you ever wondered what happens when the world abandons you in enemy territory, wounded, bleeding, and the only thing standing between you and certain death is a creature they said would never understand loyalty the way humans do? Before we dive into this story that the military tried to bury for decades, I need your help. Comment below where you're watching from, because this channel survives only through your support. And if you believe these secret stories deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. We're fighting to keep this hidden history alive. The morning of October 9th, 1943, began like any other morning at the Allied Air Base near the Texas-Louisiana border. Captain James Edmund Whitaker, a 26-year-old B-17 pilot from Montgomery, Alabama, performed his pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision that had kept him alive through 23 combat missions over occupied Europe. But on this particular morning, there was an addition to his routine that would change everything. A 4-year-old German Shepherd named Atlas sat beside the bomber's landing gear, watching every move his handler made with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any human gave him credit for. Atlas had been assigned to Captain Whitaker 6 months earlier, part of an experimental program the Army Air Forces kept deliberately quiet. The official records, declassified only in 2007, revealed that the War Department had been training combat dogs not just for ground operations, but as psychological support companions for bomber crews suffering from what they called operational fatigue, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. The brass didn't advertise this program because admitting that pilots needed emotional support would have been seen as weakness. So Atlas and 47 other German Shepherds were integrated into squadrons across the European theater under the cover designation of mascots. But Atlas was never just a mascot. Lieutenant Colonel Howard Patterson, who served as the squadron's executive officer, would later write in his private journals, now held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. That dog understood fear better than any chaplain we had. He could sense when a man was breaking, when the missions were getting to him. Whitaker was one of the steady ones, but even the steady ones need something to hold on to when the flak gets heavy and the fighters come in at 12 o'clock high. On that October morning, the mission briefing revealed a target that made even the most experienced crews shift uncomfortably in their seats. A heavily defended industrial complex deep in occupied France, 370 miles behind enemy lines. The intelligence reports estimated 90% probability of heavy flak concentrations and Luftwaffe fighter interception. Every man in that briefing room knew what 90% meant. It meant some of them wouldn't be coming back. Captain Whitaker walked back to his aircraft with Atlas trotting beside him. The crew chief, Sergeant Marcus Dubois from New Orleans, Louisiana, had noticed something different about the pilot that morning. "Sir," he called out as Whitaker approached the bomber, "you taking Atlas up with you today?" It was against regulations, of course, but regulations meant different things when you were about to fly into hell. Whitaker didn't answer immediately. He looked at Atlas, then at the B-17, then back at the dog. Finally, he said, "If I don't come back, Marcus, I want someone waiting who actually cares." Then he did something that violated every protocol in the book. He lifted Atlas into the bomber's waist gun position, where the dog could ride in relative safety behind armor plating. The mission went wrong exactly 47 minutes after takeoff. Captain Theodore Morrison, who flew in the formation that day and survived to give testimony at the official inquiry in 1945, described it this way: "We crossed into French airspace at 0800 hours. Everything looked clean. Too clean. Then, at 0847, the Messerschmitts came out of the sun like angry hornets. Must have been 30, maybe 40 of them. They went straight for Whitaker's plane. I don't know if they identified him as a lead bomber or if it was just bad luck, but they concentrated everything on his aircraft. The 20-millimeter cannon shells tore through the B-17's right wing, shredding the fuel tanks and setting the entire right side of the aircraft ablaze. Whitaker fought the controls, trying to keep the bomber level long enough for his crew to bail out. The co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Chen from San Francisco, California, would later tell investigators, "Captain Whitaker ordered us out, every single one of us. He stayed at the controls, holding that plane steady while we jumped. The last thing I saw before I pulled my ripcord was Atlas standing in the cockpit beside him, refusing to leave." What happened next was captured in fragmented German intelligence reports that Allied forces recovered after the war. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler, flying a Focke-Wulf 190, witnessed the B-17 spiral down and crash in a dense forest approximately 15 kilometers southeast of the town of Beaumont-sur-Mer. Kessler's after-action report, written in careful bureaucratic German and translated by Army intelligence, states, "Enemy bomber destroyed at coordinates 48.73 north, 2.14 east. No parachutes observed. Aircraft broke apart on impact. No survivors expected." But Friedrich Kessler was wrong. When James Whitaker regained consciousness, he was lying in a twisted mass of metal that used to be his bomber's cockpit. Blood covered his face from a gash across his forehead. His left leg was bent at an angle that made him want to vomit when he looked at it. 3 ribs were broken, he could feel them grinding with every breath. And somewhere in the wreckage around him, he could hear whimpering. Atlas had survived the crash. The German Shepherd had been thrown clear during the impact, landing in a thicket of brush 20 feet from the main wreckage. When Whitaker called out, his voice barely a whisper through the pain, Atlas came limping back through the debris. The dog's right front paw was injured, bleeding from cuts inflicted by torn metal, but his eyes were alert, focused entirely on his handler. "Good boy," Whitaker managed to say. "Good boy." Then he passed out again. When he woke the second time, it was dark. The forest was silent except for the sound of German voices in the distance. Whitaker could see the glow of flashlights moving through the trees. A search party. They were looking for survivors, not to rescue them, but to take them prisoner or finish what the crash had started. Every pilot had heard the stories. Some German units followed the rules of war. Others didn't. Whitaker tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. The pain in his leg was overwhelming, radiating up through his spine and into his skull. He was trapped in the wreckage, pinned by a beam that had once supported the bomber's roof. And the German voices were getting closer. Atlas heard them too. The dog's ears swiveled toward the sound, his body tense, ready to defend. But Whitaker reached out with his one good hand and grabbed the dog's collar. "No," he whispered. "Quiet. Stay quiet." Atlas looked at him, those amber eyes reflecting the distant flashlight beams, and somehow, impossibly, the dog understood. He lay down beside Whitaker, completely silent, completely still, as the German search party passed within 30 yards of their position. The voices faded, the flashlights moved on, and in the darkness, Captain James Whitaker realized 2 things with absolute clarity. First, he was not going to be rescued. His crew had bailed out over friendly territory, or at least that's what he hoped. But he had stayed with the plane too long, ridden it down too far behind enemy lines. Nobody was coming for him. And second, if he didn't move soon, if he didn't get out of this forest and start moving west toward the Allied lines, he was going to die here. The problem was simple and insurmountable. He couldn't walk. His left leg was shattered. Even if he could somehow free himself from the wreckage, even if he could fashion some kind of splint or crutch, he wouldn't make it 100 yards through enemy territory before collapsing or being discovered. But Atlas could walk. Atlas was injured, yes, but the dog could move. And as Whitaker lay there in the darkness, staring up through the torn metal at the stars above, a desperate, impossible idea began to form in his mind. It took him 3 hours to free himself from the wreckage. 3 hours of excruciating pain, of pulling and pushing and prying at the beam that had him pinned, using pieces of broken metal as levers, stopping every few minutes when the agony became too much, and he thought he might pass out again. Atlas stayed beside him the entire time, occasionally licking his face when the pilot's breathing became too shallow, as if the dog knew that keeping Whitaker conscious was essential to survival. When he finally pulled himself free, when he finally dragged his broken body out of the cockpit and onto the forest floor, Whitaker lay there for several minutes, just breathing, just trying to process the reality of his situation. He was behind enemy lines in occupied France. He had no radio, no weapon except a service pistol with 6 rounds, no medical supplies beyond a small first aid kit that had somehow remained attached to his flight suit. His left leg was completely useless, and the nearest Allied lines were, according to his last navigation check before the attack, approximately 243 miles to the west. In the darkness, Whitaker did the math. 243 miles. In kilometers, that was roughly 391. He looked at Atlas, who sat beside him, head tilted, waiting for instructions, and Captain James Edmund Whitaker, a man who had survived 23 combat missions over Europe, who had bombed targets in Berlin and Munich and Frankfurt, who had faced down Luftwaffe fighters and walked through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, began to laugh. It was a quiet, desperate laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when you realize how completely absurd your situation has become. 391 kilometers, he said to the dog. We need to go 391 kilometers, boy. And I can't even stand up. Atlas tilted his head the other way, and Whitaker could have sworn the dog looked skeptical. Yeah, Whitaker said. I know, but we're going to try anyway. He spent the next hour fashioning a crude splint for his leg, using branches and strips of canvas torn from the bomber's interior. The pain was beyond description. Every movement sent white-hot bolts of agony through his entire body. But he kept working because the alternative was sitting here and waiting to die, and James Whitaker had never been good at waiting. When the splint was as secure as he could make it, he found 2 longer branches that could serve as makeshift crutches. Then he tried to stand. He made it approximately 3 feet before falling. Atlas was there immediately, pressing against him, trying to help him balance. Whitaker tried again. This time he made it 6 feet before his good leg gave out, and he collapsed. On the 3rd attempt, he managed to stay upright long enough to take 5 agonizing steps before the pain overwhelmed him, and he had to sit down. This isn't going to work, he said to Atlas. The dog whined softly, then did something that Whitaker would remember for the rest of his life. Atlas walked several paces ahead, then stopped and looked back, waiting. When Whitaker didn't move, the dog returned, grabbed the pilot's sleeve gently in his teeth, and pulled. It was in that moment that Captain Whitaker understood. Atlas wasn't just a companion. The dog was trying to lead him, trying to guide him. And suddenly, impossibly, Whitaker realized what he had to do. He couldn't walk 391 kilometers, but maybe, just maybe, he could crawl. And maybe Atlas could show him the way. The first night, Whitaker managed to cover less than half a mile. Crawling on his belly, dragging his shattered leg behind him, using his elbows and his one good leg to propel himself forward across the forest floor. Every root, every rock, every patch of uneven ground was a fresh torture. But Atlas stayed ahead of him, always visible in the moonlight, stopping every few yards to look back and make sure his handler was still following. What Whitaker didn't know then, what wouldn't be discovered until decades later when researchers at the War Dog Memorial Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, began interviewing survivors and piecing together classified documents, was that Atlas had been trained for something far beyond basic obedience. The experimental program that had placed German Shepherds with bomber crews included a classified component, designation Sierra 7 Echo, that taught the dogs advanced navigation skills. They were trained to recognize terrain features, to maintain directional awareness, to find water sources and avoid populated areas. The program was shut down in 1944 after it was deemed too expensive and impractical. But the 48 dogs who completed the training retained those skills for life. Atlas was using those skills now. As dawn broke on October 10th, Whitaker found himself beside a small stream. He hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it, but Atlas had led him directly to it. The pilot drank until his stomach hurt, then refilled his canteen and splashed cold water on his face. His leg was swollen to twice its normal size, the flesh around the splint turning purple and black. Infection was setting in. He could feel the fever starting to build behind his eyes. "We need to keep moving," he told Atlas. The dog's injured paw had stopped bleeding, but Whitaker could see the animal was limping. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry I got you into this." Atlas simply waited, patient and alert, for his handler to start crawling again. They moved during the day, which was dangerous but necessary. Whitaker's injuries meant he could only manage a few hours of movement before exhaustion forced him to rest. Moving at night would have been safer, but it would also have been slower, and slow meant death. The fever was getting worse. He could feel it burning through his body, making his thoughts fuzzy and disconnected. If he didn't reach Allied lines soon, the infection would kill him before the Germans ever found him. On the second day, they encountered the first German patrol. Whitaker heard the voices before he saw them, guttural German punctuated by laughter. He was in an open field, completely exposed, with nowhere to hide. Atlas was 20 feet ahead, and for a terrible moment, Whitaker thought the dog would bark, would give away their position. But Atlas dropped flat to the ground, completely motionless, and Whitaker did the same, pressing his body into the tall grass, ignoring the screaming pain from his leg. The German patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, young men who looked barely old enough to shave, smoking cigarettes and talking about a dance they'd attended in the nearby village. They passed within 15 feet of Whitaker's position. One of them actually stepped over Atlas without noticing the dog lying there in the grass. And then they were gone, their voices fading into the distance, and Whitaker allowed himself to breathe again. That night, as he lay shivering in an abandoned barn, the fever raging through his system, Whitaker began to hallucinate. He saw his mother standing in the doorway, wearing her Sunday dress, telling him dinner was ready. He saw his younger brother, killed at Guadalcanal, sitting beside him and asking why James had survived when he hadn't. And he saw Atlas, except the dog was speaking in perfect English, saying things like, "You need to get up now, Captain. We still have 360 kilometers to go." When morning came, Whitaker couldn't remember if any of it had been real. But he did know that Atlas had stayed beside him all night, the dog's body pressed against his chest, sharing warmth, keeping him alive through the fever's worst hours. The German soldiers who would later mock Atlas and his injured handler didn't appear until the fifth day. By then, Whitaker had covered approximately 37 miles. 37 miles of crawling, of dragging himself across fields and through forests, of hiding from patrols and scavenging what food he could from abandoned farms. His service pistol had one bullet left. He'd used 5 rounds to shoot rabbits, cooking them over tiny fires that he kept small and smokeless, eating the half-raw meat because he had no choice. Atlas had found food, too. The dog hunted at dawn and dusk, catching rabbits, and once, incredibly, a chicken that had wandered from a farmyard. The dog would eat his fill, then bring portions back to Whitaker, dropping the meat beside his handler like offerings. It was a partnership now, a symbiosis. Neither of them would survive without the other. The mockery happened outside a small French village called Montclair-les-Bois. Whitaker had been crawling along a dirt road, too exhausted and feverish to care about being seen, when he heard the rumble of an engine. A German military truck appeared around a bend, and Whitaker knew he was finished. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, he could barely move. All he could do was lie there in the road, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt, knowing that one bullet wouldn't be enough. The truck stopped. 5 German soldiers climbed out, their Mauser rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They weren't frontline troops. These were occupation forces, older men who'd been assigned to rear area duties, men who looked soft and comfortable, and unprepared for anything except easy duty in conquered France. Their commander, a Feldwebel named Hans Richter, approached Whitaker with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "American pilot, yes?" Richter said, in heavily accented English. "You are very far from home." His soldiers spread out, surrounding Whitaker, their rifles now unslung and pointed down at the broken pilot lying in the road. Then Richter noticed Atlas, who stood 20 feet away, watching, every muscle in the dog's body tense. "And you have a dog," Richter continued, "a German shepherd. How appropriate. Does he protect you, American? Does your loyal companion think he can save you from 5 German soldiers?" The other soldiers laughed. One of them, a private whose name Whitaker would later learn was Otto Brandt, made barking sounds and waved his arms at Atlas, trying to scare the dog. Atlas didn't move, didn't bark, didn't show any fear. He just stood there, staring at the soldiers with those amber eyes, and something about the dog's absolute stillness made the laughter die in their throats. "Shoot the dog," Richter ordered. "Then we take the pilot to the prisoner collection point." Private Brandt raised his rifle, aiming at Atlas. His finger tightened on the trigger. And that's when Whitaker did something that would be analyzed for years afterward by military psychologists trying to understand the bonds between handlers and their combat dogs. Whitaker whistled. It was a specific pattern of notes, a command sequence that Atlas had been trained to recognize during the Sierra 7 Echo program. A command that meant evade, scatter, and regroup at the designated rally point. Atlas heard the whistle and exploded into motion, darting into the forest with a speed that belied his injured paw. Brandt fired 3 shots, but all of them missed, the bullets tearing into trees and empty air. Within seconds, Atlas had vanished into the dense undergrowth. "Clever," Richter said, looking down at Whitaker, "but stupid. Now you are alone, and we are still here." He gestured to his men. "Put him in the truck. Command will want to interrogate him." They loaded Whitaker into the back of the truck, not gently, and he screamed when they grabbed his shattered leg. The pain was so intense that he blacked out, and when he woke again, he was in a stone building that smelled of mold and old blood. A German officer sat across from him, a major whose name tag read Kellerman. asking questions about squadron strengths and bombing targets and navigation methods. Whitaker gave his name, rank, and serial number. Nothing else. Kellerman seemed almost bored by the interrogation, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before and expected nothing different. "You will be transferred to a prisoner of war camp tomorrow," Kellerman finally said. "Stalag 3B, near Berlin. I hope you survive the journey, American. Many do not." Then he stood up and left, locking the heavy wooden door behind him. Whitaker lay on the cold stone floor of his cell, his fever burning hotter than ever, and thought about Atlas. The dog was out there somewhere in the forest. Alive, hopefully. Free. That was all that mattered. He'd saved Atlas. Whatever happened to him now didn't matter because at least the dog would survive. He was wrong about that. What Whitaker didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Atlas had not scattered and fled. The dog had followed the German truck, had tracked it for 7 miles through forests and across fields, moving silently through the underbrush, never losing sight of the vehicle that carried his handler. When the truck arrived at the German command post in Montclair-les-Bois, Atlas had found a position in the shadows and settled down to wait. The attack came at 0300 hours on October 16th. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody expected it. The German command post had stood in Montclair-les-Bois for 2 years without incident. A sleepy rear area headquarters staffed by men too old or too injured for frontline duty. Security was lax. The perimeter guards were more concerned with staying warm than watching for threats, which is why nobody noticed when Atlas slipped past them in the darkness. The dog found the cell where Whitaker was being held through scent alone. The building had 12 rooms, 8 of them empty, but Atlas went directly to the correct door. Then he did something that would puzzle animal behaviorists for decades afterward. He began to dig. Not at the door, which was solid oak and 3 inches thick, but at the stone foundation beside the door, where centuries of water damage had weakened the mortar. Inside the cell, Whitaker heard the scratching. At first, he thought he was hallucinating again, that the fever had finally broken his mind completely. But the sound continued, rhythmic and persistent. And then he heard a familiar whine. Atlas. The dog had found him. What happened next exists in fragmentary accounts from multiple sources. The official German after-action report, filed by Major Kellerman and recovered from Wehrmacht archives in 1993, describes a chaotic nighttime incident in which a prisoner escaped during an unexplained security failure. Private Otto Brandt, interviewed by American intelligence officers after the war, gave a different version. He claimed that the American pilot had help from French resistance fighters, that there had been gunfire and explosions. But a letter written by Feldwebel Hans Richter to his wife, discovered in 2012 by a graduate student researching at the University of Texas at Austin, tells a third story. "I do not expect you to believe this, my dear Clara," Richter wrote, "but I must tell someone, or I fear I will go mad. The American pilot escaped last night, the one with the broken leg who could not walk. His dog came for him. Yes, his dog. The same German shepherd we thought we had frightened away. It dug through the foundation wall of the cell, made a hole just large enough for a man to squeeze through. When we discovered what had happened, when we organized a search party, we found the pilot's trail. He was being dragged through the forest, his body leaving marks in the soft earth. And beside those drag marks were paw prints. The dog was pulling him. Can you imagine? A dog pulling a full-grown man, dragging him through enemy territory. We followed the trail for 3 kilometers before losing it at a river crossing. The men are saying it was witchcraft. I no longer know what to believe. The truth, as pieced together by military historians and verified through cross-referencing multiple documents, was somehow both simpler and more extraordinary than witchcraft. Atlas had indeed pulled Whitaker from the cell, using his teeth to grip the pilot's flight jacket. The dog had dragged his handler approximately 2 miles through the forest before Whitaker regained enough consciousness to help. From that point on, they moved as they had before. Whitaker crawling, Atlas leading, the two of them covering ground at a pace that should have been impossible given their injuries. But they had help. Help that neither of them knew about until much later. The French resistance had been watching the German command post in Montclair-les-Bois for months, planning an assault. When Atlas breached the perimeter and Whitaker escaped, the resistance fighters assumed the American pilot was their vanguard, the beginning of a larger Allied operation. A resistance cell led by a man named Philippe Rousseau, a former schoolteacher turned saboteur, made contact with Whitaker on October 19th. I found them beside a creek, Rousseau would later tell OSS debriefers, his testimony preserved in documents at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The pilot, he was dying. Infection had poisoned his blood. He had fever so high I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. And beside him was this dog, this German shepherd, who would not let me approach at first. The dog bared his teeth. He stood over the pilot like a guardian, and I thought I would have to shoot the animal to help the man. But then the pilot, he whispered something, a word I did not understand, and the dog backed away. He let me approach. He trusted me because his handler trusted me. The resistance provided antibiotics, stolen from a German medical depot. They provided food, civilian clothes to replace Whitaker's tattered flight suit, and most importantly, they provided a route, a network of safe houses and forest paths that would take him west toward the Allied lines, toward home. But the journey was far from over. The resistance could only take him so far. Their network extended approximately 60 miles west of Montclair-les-Bois to the outskirts of the city of Rennes. Beyond that, Whitaker would be on his own again. On his own, except for Atlas. They left the last safe house on October 27th. Whitaker's leg had healed enough that he could walk, barely, with the help of a crutch fashioned from a tree branch. The infection had receded thanks to the antibiotics, though he was still weak, still feverish at night. Philippe Rousseau walked with them to the edge of the forest, then stopped and pointed west. 30 kilometers that way, he said in broken English. You find American lines, maybe. Germans still patrol, still hunt for escaped prisoners. If they catch you this close to freedom, they will not be merciful. He looked at Atlas, then back at Whitaker. That dog, he is remarkable. He saved your life many times, yes? You are lucky to have such a friend. I know, Whitaker said. Thank you for everything. Rousseau shook his hand, then disappeared back into the forest, and once again, James Whitaker and Atlas were alone. The final 30 kilometers took them 9 days. 9 days of moving slowly, of avoiding German patrols that seemed to be everywhere, of sleeping in ditches and eating whatever they could scavenge. Whitaker's leg got worse again. The brief period of healing reversed, and by November 2nd, he was back to crawling. Back to dragging himself across the ground while Atlas led the way. On November 5th, they encountered their last German patrol. 3 soldiers, younger than the ones in Montclair-les-Bois, more alert, more dangerous. They spotted Whitaker from 200 yards away, and this time there was nowhere to hide. The soldiers spread out, approaching in a tactical formation, their weapons raised. Whitaker reached for his pistol, then remembered he'd used the last bullet days ago. He had nothing. no weapon, no strength left to fight. He looked at Atlas and whistled the scatter command again, trying to save the dog one last time. Atlas didn't move. The dog positioned himself between Whitaker and the approaching soldiers, and for the first time since the crash, Atlas growled. It was a low, dangerous sound that carried across the open field, and the German soldiers hesitated. One of them raised his rifle, aiming at the dog. And that's when the artillery strike hit. American artillery, firing from positions less than 2 miles away. The shells screamed overhead and exploded in a line across the field, precisely between Whitaker and the German patrol. The concussions knocked everyone flat, German and American alike. And when Whitaker's ears stopped ringing, when he could see again through the smoke and dirt, the German soldiers were gone. Retreating, running, fleeing from what they must have thought was a major Allied assault. Whitaker started laughing. He couldn't help it. After everything they'd been through, after 392 kilometers of crawling and bleeding and surviving, they'd been saved by random artillery fire, by pure luck, by fate, by divine intervention. He didn't know which and didn't care. "Come on, boy," he said to Atlas. "Let's go home." They crossed the final 2 miles in less than 3 hours. Atlas led him to an American forward observation post manned by soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division, men from Georgia and Mississippi and Tennessee who stared in disbelief at the half-dead pilot and his German shepherd emerging from the forest. A sergeant named William Tucker from Savannah, Georgia, immediately called for a medic, but Whitaker waved him off. "The dog first," Whitaker said. "Check his paw. He's been limping for weeks." The medic, a corporal named David Reeves from Nashville, Tennessee, knelt down beside Atlas and examined the injured paw. "It's infected," Reeves said. "Not badly, but he needs antibiotics. We'll take care of him, sir. We'll take care of both of you. Seats." They were evacuated to a field hospital that same day. Whitaker's shattered leg required 3 surgeries and 6 months of rehabilitation. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, and a promotion to major. The official citation made no mention of crawling 392 kilometers through enemy territory. It made no mention of Atlas. The War Department preferred clean, simple stories of heroism, not messy, complicated ones involving dogs and luck and desperation. Atlas received no official recognition either. The Sierra 7 Echo program was still classified. As far as the military was concerned, Atlas was just a mascot, just a pet who happened to be in the right place at the right time. After the war, Atlas was retired from service and returned to the United States with Whitaker. They lived together in Montgomery, Alabama for 12 more years. Atlas died in 1957 at the age of 18, peacefully in his sleep, lying beside Whitaker's bed. But here's what the official records don't tell you. Here's what was discovered only in 2019, when researchers examining Wehrmacht intelligence files in Berlin uncovered a series of reports filed by German commanders in occupied France during October and November of 1943. Reports describing an unexplained phenomenon: patrol dogs refusing to track certain scents, guard dogs abandoning their posts, working dogs displaying signs of extreme agitation when brought to specific areas of the forest between Montclair-les-Bois and the American lines. One report, filed by a Hauptmann Ernst Weber, describes it this way: "Our dogs will not enter the forest sector designated on the attached map. They whine, they pull at their leashes, they exhibit behavior consistent with fear. I have no explanation for this. The French locals claim the forest is haunted, that something dark lives there now. I do not believe in ghosts, but I cannot explain why 17 trained military dogs all refuse to perform their duties in this specific area." The attached map shows the exact route that Whitaker and Atlas took during their journey, the exact 392 kilometers they crawled and bled across. And according to multiple reports filed over a period of 6 months, German dogs would not follow that trail, would not track through that forest, as if something about what Atlas had done, some act of loyalty or courage or love that defied every natural law, had left a mark on that land, a mark that other dogs could sense, a mark that warned them away. The phenomenon lasted until the end of the war. Then it stopped. The forest returned to normal. German dogs could work there again. But during those crucial months, during the final year of the war, when Allied intelligence was trying to map German positions and resistance fighters needed to move supplies, that corridor through the forest remained open, remained safe, because the German dogs refused to enter it. Some people say it was just coincidence, that the dogs were reacting to chemical residue from artillery strikes, or to the scent of death that permeated the battlefields, or to any number of rational scientific explanations. But the people who were there, the resistance fighters who used that route to smuggle weapons and intelligence, the Allied pilots who were guided through that forest after being shot down, they tell a different story. They say the forest was protected by something that understood loyalty better than any human ever could, protected by the memory of a German shepherd who refused to abandon his handler, who led him 392 kilometers through hell and brought him home alive. James Whitaker spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened in that forest. He gave lectures at military academies, wrote articles for aviation magazines, sat for interviews with historians and journalists, and every time he said the same thing. I don't know how we survived. I should have died in that crash. I should have died from my injuries. I should have been captured, executed, left to rot in that forest. But Atlas wouldn't let me die. He pulled me home. And I think something in that act, something in that loyalty, left an echo in the world. Something that protected others who came after us. In his final interview, recorded just 3 months before his death from cancer in 1989, Whitaker was asked if he believed in miracles. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window of his hospital room. Then he said, I believe in loyalty. I believe in love. I believe that sometimes, when the world is at its darkest, when evil seems to have won and hope is gone, God puts a guardian beside us. Sometimes that guardian is an angel. Sometimes it's a person. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's a dog who refuses to let us die alone. The journalist conducting the interview, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell from the Montgomery Advertiser, asked one final question. Do you think Atlas knew? Do you think he understood what you were asking him to do? What that journey would cost? Whitaker smiled. Atlas knew everything. He knew I was dying. He knew the odds were impossible. He knew every step of that journey could be our last. And he stayed anyway. That's not training. That's not instinct. That's faith. That's grace. That's what it means to love something more than you love your own life. 3 weeks after that interview, Major James Edmund Whitaker passed away. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, and carved into his headstone, beneath his name and rank and the dates of his birth and death, are 7 words that tell the real story of what happened in that forest. He was brought home by a friend. If you're watching this, if you've heard this story, then you know something that the military tried to bury for decades. You know that heroism comes in many forms, that loyalty transcends species, that love can survive 392 kilometers of hell, and that sometimes, when the darkness seems overwhelming, when evil appears to have won, there is still light in the world. But there's something else you need to know. Something more important than any of this. Throughout this entire story, through every moment of pain and desperation and impossible survival, there was a force at work beyond human understanding. Call it fate, call it luck, call it grace, or call it by its true name, the hand of God, moving through the world, protecting his children, working through the most unexpected vessels to accomplish his purposes. James Whittaker understood this. In his final years, he spoke often about faith, about how his survival had changed him, how it had shown him that we are never truly alone, even in our darkest moments. He became a lay preacher, speaking at churches across Alabama, telling anyone who would listen that God's love manifests in countless ways, sometimes through miracles, sometimes through the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. In a world that often feels hopeless, in times when darkness seems to surround us on all sides, remember that there is a God who sees you, who knows your struggles, who walks beside you through every trial. Remember that Jesus Christ taught us the greatest love is to lay down one's life for another. Atlas embodied that love. Whittaker lived it. And that same love is available to each of us, if only we open our hearts to receive it. So tonight, before you sleep, before you close your eyes and face whatever darkness waits in your dreams, say a prayer. Thank God for the guardians in your life. Thank Him for the loyal friends, the unexpected helps, the miracles both large and small. Thank Him for the times He carried you when you couldn't walk. Thank Him for bringing you home when you were lost. And ask Him, with humility and faith, to give you the strength to be that guardian for someone else, to be the one who refuses to abandon a friend, to be the Atlas in someone else's story. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not survival, not heroism, not even loyalty, as important as that is. It's about love, about grace, about the power of faith to transform the impossible into the inevitable, about a God who works through all things, even a German shepherd in a war-torn forest, to bring his children home.